The August sun beat down on Double Diamond Ranch like a hammer on an anvil, turning the Montana dust into fine powder that hung in the air with every breath of wind. Clayton Vance stood at the edge of the breaking pin, his Italian leather boots already dulled by the grit, watching his fourth professional bronc rider limp away, clutching his ribs. "Goddamn waste of money," Vance muttered, pulling a cigar from his vest pocket. The custom-made suit he wore, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, seemed absurd out here, 50 miles from the nearest stoplight. But that was the point. Clayton Vance didn't dress for Montana. Montana was supposed to dress for him. The black Mustang in the pen wheeled and snorted, nostrils flaring red in the harsh light. Storm. That's what the Bureau of Land Management paperwork had called him when Vance bought him at the wild horse auction for $30,000. The horse had been running free in the Pryor Mountains until 6 months ago, part of a herd that had roamed those ridges since the days when Crow warriors still hunted buffalo. "Mr. Vance, sir, I really think we should consider." The voice belonged to Tommy Reeves, Vance's foreman, a sunburned man in his 50s who'd worked cattle all his life and knew enough to be afraid of this horse. "Consider what?" Vance turned, smoke curling from his lips. "Giving up? I paid good money for that animal. Do you know what he'll be worth once he's broken? Once I ride him into the arena at the National Western Stock Show in Denver? The publicity alone." "He's killed 2 men in Nevada," Tommy said quietly, "before the BLM rounded him up. Stomped a rancher who tried to rope him. Kicked a horse trader so hard he never woke up." Vance's jaw tightened. He hadn't known that. The auctioneer had conveniently left out those details. But he'd be damned if he'd admit he'd been played. Not in front of his men. Not in front of this town that still looked at him like an outsider, even though he'd bought half the county. "Then we find someone better," Vance said. "Someone who actually knows what they're doing." By Friday, 7 more men had tried. A rodeo champion from Billings who'd won bronc riding at the Calgary Stampede lasted 11 seconds before Storm threw him into the fence so hard he broke his collarbone. A Native American horse trainer from the Crow Reservation stood in the pen for 20 minutes, speaking in low tones, before the horse charged him, and he had to vault the rails to save his life. That evening, Vance pushed through the doors of the Dusty Rose Saloon in town, a weathered building with swinging doors that looked like they'd been there since Montana was a territory. The bar went quiet when he entered, the way it always did. He was rich, he was powerful, but he'd never be one of them. "Whiskey," he told the bartender, slapping a $100 bill on the scarred wood. "For everyone." That got their attention. Glasses filled, men nodded their thanks, and the conversation slowly resumed. Vance downed his drink and slammed the glass down hard enough to turn heads again. "All right, listen up," he announced. "That black Mustang out at my ranch, Storm. I'll give $50,000 cash to anyone who can stay on his back for 3 minutes. But here's the deal. If nobody can do it by this time next week, he goes to the rendering plant." A murmur ran through the crowd. Old Jeb, the farrier who'd been shoeing horses in this county since Eisenhower was president, looked up from his beer with narrowed eyes. "That's a hell of a threat to make against an innocent animal," Jeb said, his voice like gravel. Vance smiled without warmth. "That innocent animal has put 8 men in the hospital. He's dangerous, he's worthless, and I'm done wasting money on him. So unless someone here thinks they're man enough to break him, he's got 7 days to live." The bar stayed quiet. 50,000 was more money than most of these people saw in 2 years, but nobody was fool enough to think it was worth dying for. "Thought so," Vance said, dropping another bill for the whiskey. He turned to leave, but Jeb's voice stopped him. "You know what your problem is, Vance," the old man said. "You think everything can be bought, broken, or bulldozed. Some things just ain't meant to be owned." Vance paused at the door, looking back over his shoulder. "Everything can be owned, old man. You just need enough money or enough patience. I've got both." The screen door slammed behind him, and the Lincoln Navigator's engine roared to life outside, drowning out the crickets for a moment before fading into the distance. Caleb had been sleeping in the old Morrison barn for 3 weeks before anyone noticed. The barn sat on the eastern edge of town, its roof half collapsed, its walls gray with age and neglect. The Morrison family had moved to Boise 2 decades ago, and the property had been in legal limbo ever since. Too remote to develop, too worthless to buy. It was perfect for someone who didn't want to be found. He'd arrived in town on foot, carrying everything he owned in a canvas rucksack that had seen better days. 22 years old, maybe 23. Even he wasn't entirely sure anymore. His flannel shirt was faded to the point where the original red had turned pink. His jeans were held up with a length of rope instead of a belt, and his boots were splitting at the seams. Nobody asked questions. In a place like this, people understood that some folks needed to disappear for a while. As long as you didn't cause trouble, you could be invisible. Caleb spent his days doing odd jobs, chopping firewood for Mrs. Higgins at the general store, mucking out stalls at the county fairgrounds, fixing fence posts for anyone who'd pay him $20 and a hot meal. He didn't talk much. When he did, his voice carried the soft drawl of someone from further south, Oklahoma, maybe, or northern Texas. He was at the fairgrounds on Tuesday morning, replacing rotted boards on an old horse stall, when he first heard about Storm. Did you hear? Sarah Martinez, who ran the 4-H program, was talking to another volunteer while Caleb worked. Clayton Vance is going to kill that Mustang he bought. Says if nobody can ride him by Saturday, he's sending him to the glue factory. That's just cruel, the other woman said. I heard that horse was running wild until 6 months ago. Of course he's going to fight being ridden. Vance doesn't care. It's all about his ego. He told everyone at the Dusty Rose that the horse was worthless if he couldn't be broken. Caleb's hammer paused mid-swing. He set it down carefully and stood, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. This horse, he said quietly. Where's he at? Sarah looked surprised that he'd spoken. Out at Double Diamond Ranch. Why? You're not thinking of trying, are you? 8 men have already been hurt. Caleb didn't answer. He picked up his tools, nodded a goodbye, and walked out of the fairgrounds. He found old Jeb at the farrier shop on the north side of town, a corrugated metal building that smelled of hot iron and hoof shavings. The old man was bent over an anvil, shaping a horseshoe with steady, practiced strikes. Help you? Jeb asked without looking up. I heard about the Mustang, Caleb said. Now Jeb looked up, studying the young man with sharp eyes. A lot of people heard about him. What's your interest? I'd like to try. Jeb snorted and went back to his work. You and every cowboy with a death wish. What makes you think you're any different? I don't plan to break him, Caleb said simply. I plan to listen to him. The hammer paused. Jeb straightened slowly, his back creaking. He was maybe 70, maybe older, with hands scarred from a lifetime of working with fire and iron and animals that could kill you if you weren't careful. You know anything about horses, son? Some. Jeb wiped his hands on his leather apron. I've been shoeing horses for 50 years. You want to know what I know about that Mustang? He's scared. He's angry. And he's got every right to be. They rounded him up, pinned him, sold him to a man who sees him as a trophy. Now Vance wants to break his spirit or end his life. He paused. You really think you can help him? I'd like to try. Something in Caleb's voice, or maybe in his eyes, made Jeb nod slowly. All right, but you do this my way. We go out there together. And if that horse so much as flattens his ears at you, you walk away. Deal. They drove out to Double Diamond Ranch the next morning in Jeb's ancient Ford pickup, the one with the horse trailer that rattled like it might fall apart at any moment. The ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of prime Montana grassland, with white-painted fences that probably cost more than most people's houses. Tommy Reeves met them at the gate, skepticism written all over his face. Jeb, didn't know you were in the bronc riding business these days. I'm not. This is Caleb. He wants to try with Storm. Tommy looked at Caleb, really looked at him, taking in the worn clothes, the quiet demeanor, the hands that were calloused but not from roping or ranch work. No offense, son, but we've had professional rodeo riders fail. What makes you think? Where's the horse? Caleb asked. They walked him to the breaking pen, where Storm stood in the far corner, head high, eyes rolling white. The horse was magnificent, 17 hands of pure wild muscle, black as midnight except for a white star between his eyes. His coat bore scars from barbed wire, from other horses, from men with ropes and whips. Clayton Vance was there too, leaning against the fence with a few of his associates. Men in expensive western wear that had never seen a day of actual work. They were drinking coffee from a thermos, laughing about something. Well, Vance called out when he saw them approach. Old Jeb brought me another volunteer. What is he? The janitor from your shop. The men with Vance laughed. Caleb ignored them, walking up to the fence and standing there, just watching the horse. Storm watched back, every muscle tense, ready to explode. "You've got 3 minutes, Vance said, checking his Rolex. "Same as everyone else. If you can stay on his back for 3 minutes, 50,000 is yours. Cash." Caleb climbed over the fence and dropped into the pen. "He's not even wearing spurs," one of Vance's friends said, amused. "Or a rope," another added. Caleb walked to the center of the pen, not toward the horse, just to the center, and then did something that made everyone fall silent. He sat down. He sat down in the dust, cross-legged, his back to the horse. "What the hell is he doing?" Vance muttered. Jeb smiled slightly. "Something your boys never tried. He's waiting." Storm pawed the ground, sending up a small cloud of dust. His ears swiveled forward, then back, trying to make sense of this strange human who didn't chase, didn't shout, didn't carry a whip or a rope. The horse took a cautious step forward, then another. Caleb sat perfectly still, breathing slowly, evenly. He'd learned this method years ago, from an old Comanche man in Oklahoma who'd traded horses before the government regulations made it impossible. "You don't take their freedom," the old man had told him. "You wait until they choose to give it." Minutes passed. The sun climbed higher. Vance looked at his watch impatiently, but even he seemed curious now. Storm circled closer, his hooves careful in the dust. When he was about 10 feet away, he stopped and lowered his head, nostrils flaring as he tried to catch Caleb's scent. Caleb remained motionless, his eyes half closed, his posture non-threatening. The horse took another step, then another. Now he was close enough that Caleb could hear his breathing. Heavy, uncertain, but no longer panicked. Slowly, so slowly that it was almost imperceptible, Caleb extended his hand palm up in the dust beside him. Not reaching toward the horse, just offering. Storm's ears flicked forward. He stretched his neck out, his muzzle inches from Caleb's hand, and exhaled a long breath that stirred the dust. Then, for the first time since he'd been captured, the Mustang lowered his head and allowed himself to be touched. Caleb's fingers brushed the soft muzzle, then moved slowly up to the white star between Storm's eyes. He began to hum, a low, wordless tune that seemed to come from somewhere deep and old. The horse's eyes half closed. "I'll be damned," Tommy Reeves whispered. After what might have been 10 minutes, or might have been an hour, Caleb stood. He moved like water, smooth and unhurried, keeping one hand on Storm's neck. The horse didn't bolt, didn't even flinch. Caleb walked around to Storm's left side, still humming, still touching. Then, in one fluid motion, he gripped a handful of mane and swung himself up onto the horse's back. Storm's muscles tensed. His head came up. But when Caleb simply sat there, not kicking, not pulling, not demanding, the horse relaxed. He took a tentative step forward, then another. Then, as if testing this new reality, he walked in a slow circle around the pen, with Caleb sitting quietly on his back. 3 minutes passed, then 5, then 10. "Time," Vance said flatly. Caleb slid down from Storm's back and stood beside him, one hand on the horse's shoulder. Storm nuzzled his shirt pocket, looking for treats that weren't there. Vance pulled out a thick envelope from his jacket and threw it over the fence. It landed in the dust at Caleb's feet, bills visible through the opening. "Congratulations," Vance said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You've got your money." Caleb didn't pick up the envelope. He looked at Vance directly for the first time, his gray eyes steady. "I don't want the money," he said. "According to the bet, if I rode him, he's mine." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Excuse me," Vance said slowly. "You said 50,000 to anyone who could ride him. You didn't say I had to take the money. The bet was about the horse. I won. He's mine now." Vance's face went red. "That's not how this works, you little." "Actually," Jeb cut in, stepping forward, "that's exactly how it works. You made a public bet. Everyone at the Dusty Rose heard you. You said if someone could ride him for 3 minutes, that person would win. You never specified what win meant. In common law, ambiguous contracts are interpreted against the person who wrote them. That's you, Vance. You're going to quote law to me?" Vance took a step toward the fence. "I own 3 lawyers on retainer in Helena. I'll bury both of you." Caleb opened the gate and led Storm out of the pen. The horse followed him like a dog, calm and willing. "You can try," Caleb said quietly. "But right now, in front of all these witnesses, I'm taking what I earned." He walked toward Jeb's trailer, Storm's hoofbeats steady behind him. Vance stood frozen, his associates looking uncomfortable, Tommy Reeves staring at his boots. "This isn't over," Vance called after them. "You hear me? This isn't over." Caleb didn't look back. He loaded Storm into the trailer. The horse walked right in, no resistance, and climbed into Jeb's truck. As they pulled away, Jeb glanced at the young man beside him. "You know you just made an enemy of the richest, most vindictive man in the county, right?" "Yes, sir," Caleb said. "And you're okay with that?" Caleb looked out the window at the mountains in the distance. "That horse has been running from men with money and power his whole life. Figure it's about time someone stood up for him." Jeb was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "You can keep him in my back paddock. It's not much, but it's got good grass and a creek." "I can pay." "With what?" "You just turned down $50,000. Jeb shook his head. "Don't worry about it. Something tells me we're going to need to stick together on this." He was right. The trouble came 3 nights later, just after midnight, when most of the town was asleep. Caleb had been bedded down in the small tack room at the back of Jeb's farrier's shop, sleeping on a cot with a wool blanket that smelled of horses and hay. Storm was in the paddock out back, grazing peacefully under a sky full of stars. The sound of truck engines woke him. He was on his feet instantly, looking through the small window. 3 pickup trucks had pulled up, big F-350s with lifted suspensions and light bars that lit up the property like daytime. 6 men climbed out, all wearing double diamond ranch jackets. "We know you're in there," one of them called out. "Mr. Vance wants his horse back. You can make this easy or hard, but we're taking him either way." Caleb was pulling on his boots when he heard the unmistakable sound of a pump-action shotgun being racked. He looked up to see old Jeb standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the truck lights, a Remington 870 held steady in his weathered hands. "Only place you boys are taking anything is back to your trucks," Jeb said calmly. "Right now? Before this gets ugly." The ranch hands exchanged glances. They'd been expecting the young drifter alone, not a 70-year-old man with a shotgun who looked like he knew how to use it. "Now, Jeb," the lead hand said, holding up his palms, "we don't want any trouble. We're just following orders." "Then follow different orders. This is private property, and you're trespassing. I'm well within my rights under Montana law to defend it. You're going to shoot us over a damn horse." "Haven't decided yet," Jeb said, "but I'm leaning that direction." More truck lights appeared on the road. Then more. Within minutes, half a dozen vehicles had pulled up. People from town, woken by phone calls from neighbors who had heard the commotion. Mrs. Higgins was there, standing on the running board of her son's truck with a baseball bat. Sebastian Cooper, a Marine veteran who'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan, stood with his arms crossed, his service pistol visible on his hip. Even Sarah Martinez from the fairgrounds had come, along with a dozen others. "Interesting odds," Jeb observed. 6 of you, 15 of us. And unlike you boys, most of us actually know how to shoot." The ranch hands looked at each other again. This had been supposed to be a simple job: intimidate the kid, take the horse, collect their bonus from Vance. Nobody had said anything about facing down half the town. "Tell Vance he's crossed a line," Jeb continued. "This ain't about property anymore. This is about right and wrong. And if he wants to keep pushing, he's going to find out that money don't mean much when people decide they've had enough of being pushed around." The lead hand backed toward his truck. "Mr. Vance ain't going to like this." "I imagine he won't," Jeb agreed. "But that's his problem, not yours. Now get off my land before I decide to let Sebastian here show you what he learned in the Marines about perimeter defense." The trucks left, their light bars casting long shadows as they disappeared down the road. The crowd of townspeople stayed for another hour, drinking coffee that Mrs. Higgins had somehow thought to bring in a thermos, talking quietly among themselves. "Appreciate you all coming," Jeb told them as they finally prepared to leave. "Hell, Jeb," Sebastian said. "We've been waiting for someone to stand up to Vance for years. About time somebody did." When they were alone again, Caleb turned to the old man. "You didn't have to do that." "Yeah, I did," Jeb said, unloading his shotgun. "That horse deserves better than Vance. And so do you." He paused. "Besides, I've been living in this town for 50 years. Tom, I actually did something worth remembering." But Caleb knew it wasn't over. Men like Clayton Vance didn't back down just because they'd been embarrassed. They escalated. And sure enough, 2 days later, the sheriff arrived with a warrant. Sheriff Tom Hendricks was a decent man caught in an indecent situation. He'd known Jeb for 30 years, had been buying his daughter's horses from the fairgrounds where Caleb worked. But he'd also been getting phone calls from the county prosecutor, who'd been getting phone calls from Helena, who'd been getting calls from Clayton Vance's lawyers. He stood in Jeb's driveway, warrant in hand, looking deeply uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Jeb," he said, "but I've got a complaint filed for theft of livestock. Says this young man here stole a horse valued at $30,000 from Double Diamond Ranch." "That's bullshit and you know it, Tom," Jeb said. "What I know doesn't matter. I've got a warrant." He looked at Caleb. "Son, I need you to come with me. And I need that horse impounded as evidence." "Evidence of what?" Caleb asked quietly. "I want him fair and square. There were witnesses. Vance says there was no contract. Says you just took his horse." "He's lying." "Well, that's for a judge to decide." Sheriff Hendricks sighed. "Look, I don't like this any more than you do. But if you don't come peacefully, I'll have to arrest you for resisting. And if anyone tries to stop me, I'll have to arrest them too. Please don't make me do that." Caleb looked at Storm, grazing peacefully in the paddock, then back at the sheriff. "All right, I'll come. But I need someone to look after Storm." "I've got him," Jeb said. "Tom, you can impound him here. I'll take responsibility." The sheriff nodded gratefully. "Fair enough." They drove to the county courthouse in silence. Caleb was processed, fingerprinted, photographed, charged with grand theft. The bail was set at $20,000, an amount he couldn't possibly pay. He was given a court-appointed attorney, a young woman named Samantha Carter, who looked fresh out of law school and terrified. "I've read the complaint," she told him in the holding cell. "It's not good. Vance has 3 ranch hands who'll testify that you never completed the bet, that you just took the horse. His lawyer is Richard Stromberg from Billings, probably the best trial attorney in the state. Our best bet is to plead this down to misdemeanor trespass." "No," Caleb said. "Mr. Caleb." She didn't even have a last name to use. "I understand you feel like you're in the right. But this is a felony charge. If you lose at trial, you could go to prison for 5 years. A plea deal would mean maybe 6 months county jail and restitution." "I won that horse fair and square," Caleb said. "I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do." Sam rubbed her temples. "Then we're going to trial. And I have to be honest, our chances aren't great." The preliminary hearing was set for the following Tuesday. Jeb managed to scrape together enough for bail, using his property as collateral, and Caleb was released. But the damage was done. The story had made the local papers. Drifter accused of stealing from prominent rancher. Some people believed him. Others didn't. And Vance made sure his side of the story was the one that got told loudest. The morning of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Vance sat in the front row with his legal team, looking confident. Caleb sat with Sam Carter, wearing borrowed clothes from Jeb's closet that didn't quite fit. Judge Patricia Ashford was a stern woman in her 60s who'd been on the bench for 20 years. She didn't tolerate nonsense, which could go either way. "This is a preliminary hearing," she announced. "I'm here to determine if there's sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Mr. Stromberg, you may present your case." The prosecution's case was straightforward. 3 ranch hands testified that the bet had been informal, that Vance had never intended to actually give away the horse, that Caleb had simply taken him without permission. They were credible, consistent, and well-coached. When it was Sam's turn, she called Jeb to the stand. "Mr. Morrison, you were present at the Dusty Rose Saloon when Mr. Vance made his statement about the horse, correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you tell the court what he said?" "He said, and I quote, 'I'll give $50,000 cash to anyone who can stay on his back for 3 minutes. If nobody can do it by this time next week, he goes to the rendering plant.' Did he mention anything about the horse's ownership?" "No, ma'am. But the implication was clear. If you could ride him, you'd won. That's how bets work out here. Your word means something." Stromberg tore into Jeb on cross-examination, pointing out that he was friends with the defendant, that he had a bias, that implications weren't legally binding contracts. Judge Ashford looked ready to rule, and from her expression, it wasn't going to be in Caleb's favor when the courtroom doors opened. A man walked in, wearing a Stetson hat and a beyond-the-lookout tie, moving with the slow confidence of someone who'd spent his life working the land. He was maybe 60, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen everything. "Your Honor," he said in a clear voice. "I apologize for the interruption. My name is William Henderson. I own the Triple H Ranch north of here. And I have something the court needs to see." "Mr. Henderson, Judge Ashford said, surprised. This is highly irregular. Yes, ma'am, it is. But so is watching a man lie under oath. He walked forward and placed something on the judge's bench. That there is a bar napkin from the Dusty Rose Saloon, dated the night Mr. Vance made his bet. And that's his signature on it. The courtroom erupted. Vance stood up, his face pale. What the hell are you doing, Bill? What I should have done from the start, Henderson said. Calling you out on your bullshit. Judge Ashford banged her gavel. Order. Mr. Henderson, explain yourself. Your Honor, I was at the Dusty Rose that night. I was sitting right next to Clayton when he made his big announcement. He was drunk and showing off, and one of his friends, as a joke, wrote up the bet on a napkin and had him sign it. Winner takes all, it says right there. If you can ride Storm for 3 minutes, the horse is yours, signed Clayton Vance. The judge examined the napkin carefully. Mr. Stromberg, does your client want to dispute this signature? Stromberg looked at Vance, who sat frozen. The lawyer's shoulders slumped. No, Your Honor. Then this appears to be a written contract, informal though it may be. Montana recognizes such contracts under common law. She looked at Caleb. Young man, it seems you won this horse legitimately. Charges dismissed. The gavel came down. The courtroom cleared slowly, people congratulating Caleb, shaking Jeb's hand. But Caleb made his way straight to William Henderson, who was putting on his hat to leave. Mr. Henderson, Caleb said. Why'd you help me? You don't even know me. Henderson studied him for a moment. No, I don't. But I knew your father. Caleb went very still. My father, James Brennan. He worked on my ranch about 25 years ago. Best horse trainer I ever had. You've got his eyes, and you've got his way with animals. Henderson paused. He left when you were just a baby. Said he had some trouble he needed to run from. Never told me what. But he was a good man, and he loved horses the way you do. When I heard about what you did with Storm, I knew who you had to be. Caleb's throat was tight. He died when I was 8. Foster care after that. I'm sorry to hear it, Henderson said quietly. But he'd be proud of what you did here. Standing up to someone like Vance, that takes guts. And doing it the right way, that takes character. He handed Caleb a business card. You ever need work, a real job, you come find me. I could use a good hand who knows horses. Thank you, sir. Outside the courthouse, Vance was surrounded by reporters from the local paper and a TV crew that had driven up from Billings. His face was red with fury. This is a miscarriage of justice, he was saying. That animal is dangerous, and— Mr. Vance, a reporter called out. Why did you sign a contract giving away your horse if you didn't intend to honor it? I was drunk. It was a joke, but you were sober when you threatened to kill the horse if nobody could ride it, correct? Vance saw Caleb and Jeb emerging from the courthouse. For a moment, their eyes met. The rich man who'd thought he could buy anything, and the drifter who'd proven him wrong. Then Vance turned and stalked to his Lincoln Navigator, his lawyer hurrying after him. The vehicle roared to life and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust and the smell of expensive exhaust. Think he'll cause more trouble? Caleb asked Jeb as they walked to the old truck. Men like that always cause trouble, Jeb said. But we handled him this time. We'll handle him again if we need to. They drove back to the farrier's shop, where Storm was waiting in the paddock. When he saw Caleb, the horse lifted his head and whinnied, a sound of recognition, of welcome. Caleb climbed the fence and Storm trotted over, pushing his head against Caleb's chest. What are you going to do now? Jeb asked. Caleb ran his hand along Storm's neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the sleek black coat. I'm going to do what he's been waiting to do since they caught him. I'm going to set him free. You mean you're going to let him go? Not exactly. Caleb smiled, the first real smile Jeb had seen from him. I mean, I'm going to let him choose. If he wants to run wild again, back to the mountains, I'll ride him up there and let him go. If he wants to stay with me. Then we'll figure it out together. But it's got to be his choice. The next morning, half the town showed up to watch. Word had spread about what Caleb planned to do, and people wanted to see it. Mrs. Higgins brought coffee and pastries. Sebastian brought his camera. Even Sarah from the fairgrounds was there with her 4-H kids, wanting them to learn something about freedom and respect. Caleb stood in the center of the paddock with Storm. He'd spent the past hour brushing him, talking to him, explaining what was about to happen. Now he swung up onto the horse's back. No saddle, no bridle, just trust, and pointed him toward the open gate. Storm understood. He could feel it in the way the horse's muscles bunched, the way his ears pricked forward. Beyond the gate lay the road, and beyond the road lay the foothills, and beyond the foothills lay the Pryor Mountains where he'd been born. "You're free," Caleb whispered. "You can go. I won't stop you." Storm took a step toward the gate, then another. He walked through it into the road, and Caleb could feel the horse trembling with the awareness of open space, of possibility. And then Storm stopped. He turned his head, looking back at Caleb, at Jeb, at all the people gathered there. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then Storm turned around and walked back through the gate into the paddock. He'd chosen. The crowd erupted in cheers. Jeb wiped his eyes and pretended it was dust. Mrs. Higgins was crying openly, and she wasn't alone. Caleb slid down from Storm's back and wrapped his arms around the horse's neck. "All right then," he said softly. "We're in this together." That afternoon, Caleb called the number on William Henderson's card. "Mr. Henderson? It's Caleb. Caleb Brennan." He paused, testing out his father's last name for the first time in years. It felt right. "That job offer still stand?" "Absolutely," Henderson said. "When can you start?" "Tomorrow. But I've got one condition. My horse comes with me." Henderson laughed. "Son, I've got 200 acres of prime pasture. Your horse will think he died and went to heaven." As the sun set that evening, Caleb stood with Storm in Jeb's paddock one last time, watching the light turn the mountains gold and purple. "You know what the best part is?" Jeb said, coming to stand beside him. "It wasn't just about saving the horse. You saved something in this town, too. You reminded us that we don't have to let men like Vance run roughshod over what's right. That sometimes standing up for something small, like one wild horse, can mean standing up for something much bigger." "Freedom," Caleb said. "Yeah, freedom." Jeb smiled. "Your daddy would be proud." 3 months later, Caleb was working full-time at the Triple H Ranch, living in the bunkhouse, earning an honest wage. Storm had his own section of pasture where he could run as much as he wanted, but every morning he was waiting at the fence for Caleb, ready to work. Clayton Vance sold Double Diamond Ranch and moved to Scottsdale. The gossip was that he couldn't stand the humiliation, couldn't stand driving through town and seeing people whisper and point. His lawyers had tried to sue Caleb for the cost of the horse, but the case was laughed out of court. And on Saturdays, Caleb would ride Storm into town, and they'd stop at the Dusty Rose Saloon. He'd tie Storm outside. Though he didn't need to, the horse would wait for hours if necessary, and he'd go inside and have a beer with Jeb and talk about the week. People said Storm had mellowed, that he'd become gentle. But Caleb knew better. The horse hadn't changed. He'd just finally found someone who understood that freedom isn't about the absence of connection. It's about the choice to connect. One Saturday evening, as Caleb was finishing his beer, a young girl from the 4-H program came running into the bar, out of breath. "Caleb, there's a horse at the fairgrounds. Someone abandoned him, and he's terrified, and he's going to hurt himself, and nobody can get near him." Caleb set down his beer and looked at Jeb. "Go on," the old man said. "Seems like this is what you do now." Caleb walked outside to where Storm was waiting. He swung up onto the horse's back, and together they rode toward the fairgrounds, toward another frightened animal who just needed someone to listen. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. The wind carried the smell of sage and pine, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as it rode the thermals home. It was the same wind that had always blown across this land, the same mountains that had stood for millions of years. But something had changed, something small but important. A young man and a wild horse had reminded a town what it meant to stand for something, had shown them that freedom, real freedom, isn't taken or given. It's earned through trust, protected through courage, and shared through choice. And that was worth more than all the money Clayton Vance could ever spend. 2 years later, Caleb Brennan stood in the center of the arena at the county fairgrounds, Storm beside him, facing a crowd of nearly 500 people. He'd been invited to give a demonstration of natural horsemanship, and word had spread far beyond the county. There were ranchers from Wyoming, trainers from Idaho, even a documentary filmmaker from California. But the person Caleb was most aware of was the 10-year-old boy in the front row, holding the lead rope of a small gray gelding that had been rescued from a neglect case. The boy's name was Marcus, and he'd been in foster care for 3 years. Sarah Martinez had brought him to meet Caleb a month ago. "He doesn't talk much," she'd said. Hasn't said a word since they found him. But he draws horses. Hundreds of them. Caleb had recognized something in Marcus's eyes. The same wariness. The same walls that he'd built around his own heart at that age. Now, as he worked with Storm in the arena, showing how patience and respect could accomplish what force never could, Caleb was really talking to Marcus. The thing about horses, he said, his voice carrying across the quiet crowd, is they remember everything. Every time someone hurt them, every time someone helped them. Storm here, he remembered being chased, being trapped, being treated like property instead of a living thing. And he fought back, because that's what you do when you've got no other choice. He walked over to Storm and rested his hand on the horse's shoulder. But he also remembered the moment someone sat down in the dust and waited for him. Remembered that there are people in this world who see you for who you are, not what they want you to be. And that memory, that one moment of connection, it changed everything. Storm lowered his head and rested it against Caleb's chest, exactly as he'd done that first day in the paddock. The crowd murmured in appreciation, but Caleb was looking at Marcus. Sometimes, he said quietly, the bravest thing you can do is trust again, even when you've got every reason not to. After the demonstration, people lined up to talk to Caleb, to ask questions, to share their own stories of difficult horses they'd rehabbed. But Caleb noticed Marcus hanging back, still holding his gelding's lead rope. Caleb walked over and crouched down to the boy's level. Hey, your horse got a name. Marcus shook his head. You want help finding one? The boy looked up at him, and Caleb saw himself reflected there, lonely, scared, not sure if the world was a place worth trusting. You know, Caleb said softly, I used to be like you. Didn't talk much. Didn't trust much. Figured if I didn't let anyone in, they couldn't hurt me. He paused. But then I met a horse who was just as scared as I was. And we helped each other figure out that being alone isn't the same as being safe. Marcus's grip on the lead rope tightened. Tell you what, Caleb said. Mr. Henderson, that's my boss. He's got this program where kids can come work with horses on weekends. Learn how to care for them, ride them, understand them. You interested? For the first time, Marcus nodded. All right then. We start next Saturday at 8. Bring your gelding. We'll find him a name together. As Caleb walked back to where Storm was waiting, Jeb came up beside him. You're building something here, the old man said. Something bigger than you realize. Just trying to help some horses, Caleb said. No, Jeb said. You're helping people remember what freedom really means. That it's not about being alone. It's about having the choice not to be. That night, Caleb rode Storm back to the Triple H ranch under a sky full of stars. The mountains rose dark against the horizon, ancient and permanent. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of wildflowers and possibility. Storm moved beneath him with the easy confidence of a horse who knew where he belonged, who'd chosen his herd and his home not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And Caleb understood, finally, what his father must have felt all those years ago. That connection to another living thing, that trust freely given and carefully kept, it was worth more than all the money in the world. It was worth running from, worth fighting for, worth building a life around. In the distance, he could see the lights of the ranch house, where William Henderson was probably reading in his study. In the paddock beyond, 24 horses grazed peacefully, including 3 rescues that Caleb had gentled over the past year. And starting next Saturday, there would be one more, a small gray gelding and a quiet boy who both needed to learn that trust was possible. Caleb smiled and urged Storm into a canter, and together they raced across the pasture toward home, toward the future, toward all the broken things that were waiting to be made whole again. The wild horse and the wandering boy had found each other. And in finding each other, they'd found the one thing that neither laws nor money could ever truly provide. The freedom to choose love over fear. The freedom to choose connection over isolation. The freedom to run, not away from the world, but toward the parts of it worth keeping. And under the vast Montana sky, that freedom sang like thunder, like hope, like the sound of hoofbeats drumming against the earth, carrying them both toward morning.